I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, the legacy of Phyllis Schlafly, who passed away before she had a chance to see President Trump elected back in September of 2016. She died. The legacy of Phyllis Schlafly is threatened now as the state of Georgia has apparently some bipartisan agreement that they should go ahead and ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, you'll remember back in the 1970s, the Schlafly led a movement that was successful in killing the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which passed through the Senate back in 1972. Essentially, it basically says men and women are equal. And what I want to ask you is this a prime opportunity for President Trump to win some support among the teetering females of the country by coming out vocally to back the Equal Rights Amendment?
I have to tell you that of all of the devil's advocate introductions you've ever done, that was by far the most
devilish,
fantastic, fantastical. No, I don't think he should do that, Scott. The reason that the Equal Rights Amendment did not become a constitutional amendment is because it's not necessary. Because the amendments that are dealing with equal protection and so on and so forth are dealing with people. They're dealing with citizens. It doesn't specify that men shall be free from slavery and on 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 we go. So why Georgia would be doing this is beyond me. The only time that this amendment had a chance to pass was when it was on everybody's lips back, I want to say early 70s, 73, 4, somewhere in there, feels about right.
Well, Bill, women's issues are now on everybody's lips again, especially in the wake of things like the Me Too movement. And the state of Virginia actually had a nascent effort to get this ratified. Believe it or not, it was stopped by a leader of a conservative organization. I want to get her name right. Her name is Victoria Cobb, and she's the leader of a conservative women's group in Virginia who managed to keep the bill from getting out of committee so it could go to a vote. So now, Georgia is the next place, but this is a national movement, and the time is now, as they might say.
It's not. If there was a time for this, it was certainly before the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where most of the women, certainly that I know, and with the exception of a very noisy few on the far left, saw what the so-called feminist movement did to a perfectly good man and his honor and integrity. A person makes a claim that 20 years ago, at a place she can't remember, at a time she can't remember, at a place where she had no ride or transportation to, that she says her friends remember and none of her friends remember. When you have that come up and America's men and women get a look at what this mutation of feminism is all about. No, the time for this is long gone. And I think people are pretty tired of the canard about women making 78 cents compared to men too. And anytime I hear anybody trot that argument out, you are now at the point when it's been so conclusively, I don't want to say debunked, because debunked it's a P.T. Barnum term. It's been destroyed. It's been refuted. It's been explained. It's been all of these things. If you take the total male average, total number of men divided by their wages, total number of women divided by their wages, you get an excess salary in part of the men. But what's not factored into that is that they work longer hours in tougher jobs with higher paying jobs, more overtime, and all the rest. It's perfectly explainable. And I like to say, and you and the rest of our listeners know this to be true, that what they're claiming is that women are still being suppressed, legally oppressed by the legal system, as if I was a manager at Target and I'm going to try and find myself an assistant manager, and some young woman comes in and she's a perfect candidate and she says, how much does it pay? And I say, well, it's $30,000 a year, but that's for men, sweet cheeks, $24,000 for you. As if that could happen anywhere today. The whole thing is fiction. It's fiction. And they're using this fiction to continue to try and divide Americans every single way they can possibly be divided.
Let's just say the time has gone, as you said, for this amendment. Let's just say that there is actually I'm stipulating, no practical benefit to the passing of this amendment.
Right.
What's the harm in it? And doesn't it score some points if Republicans get behind it and say,
no,
yeah, we believe in this too?
It doesn't score Republicans any point to get behind a useless, out-of-date piece of legislation that was designed to protect people who are already protected under the Constitution. And 30 or 40 years after the moment when this was hot, if you want to take the case of what society looked like in the early 70s, women were definitely entering the marketplace in real numbers, but it was nothing like today. And college graduates are highly biased in favor of females today. If anybody needs an equal rights amendment today, it's the men. But fortunately, we're not that kind of, as a general rule, not made up of such hysterical crybabies as some of these people of both sexes promoting this constant argument about how unfair everything is. It's not unfair at all. And the reason you don't include it symbolically, Scott, is because if you do, pretty soon we're going to have constitutional amendments for National Donut Day. You know, I mean, if we're gonna go ornamental on this, if we're just going to say, well, you know, it looks good and we should do it because it shows our commitment to blah 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 blah. You know, how many proclamations are read on the floor of Congress every day? How many days I don't think there's ever been a day, perhaps except in times of wartime or crisis, when somebody hasn't gotten a letter from someone and stands up and reads into the congressional record, usually by himself or herself, you see how it works? And they usually say something like, I would like to recognize that February is National Donut Month. And
now, Bill, you've just done something that the left will go ballistic on, because essentially you've analogized something as crucial as the right of women to enjoy equal treatment under the law with men, and you've tried to compare that to some trivial praise of Donuts Day. Would you like to retract that statement and say something different?
No, I never retract a statement unless I can find out that I'm factually incorrect, in which case I'll retract it and explain why. No, I won't retract it. Of course I won't retract it. I'm not making fun of women having equal rights or equal opportunity. They've had that for 40, 50, 60, 70 years now. They've had it legally for practically a century, but culturally they've had it for my entire lifetime. I'm not making fun of women having equal rights. Women have equal rights everywhere. I walk into my building, I'm surrounded by women who are doing their jobs like everybody else and not complaining about things. They know that this kind of discrimination is illegal, has been illegal, continues to be illegal, and will be illegal. What I'm making fun of is people who continue to constantly try and wring some kind of false injustice out of society because this is all they know how to do. If you don't have anything to complain about, then you don't need the left. The entire predication of the left is that we've got to fix these evils in American society. Well, listen, if it turned out that women didn't have equal rights for men, and if it turned out women didn't have equal protection under the law, and if it turned out that women didn't have the right to own property, if it turned out women couldn't vote, and so on and so on and so on, then I'd say, my God, it's time for the Equal Rights Amendment. But since none of this stuff is true, it's not.
I can easily see, despite all the logic that you put behind your argument, the vast majority of Americans saying, hey, why are you so harsh about this? Why would you get so angry about this? Why don't you just acknowledge that this is something, if only for historical purposes, that we need to publicly say, and in the wake of the Me Too movement and the time is up and all that kind of stuff, that it's time that we stand up and make a simple declarative statement on behalf of women? Do you see, I'm guessing that Democrats are going to use statements like the one you just made against every Republican in every race in the country.
I hope they do. I hope they do use it. I hope they say exactly what I just said, that the idea of Georgia passing the Equal Rights Amendment is essentially opening the door to having the constitutional amendments for National Donut Day. The Constitution is designed to provide a series of laws throughout the entire land, and it needs to be modified as little as possible, which is why it's so difficult to change the Constitution and amend it, and that is why the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass 40 or 50 years ago. In the 40 or 50 years since the non-passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the position of women in this society has become so strong and has become so overwhelming. It's way beyond parity now. Parity, not parody. These people are beyond parity. And so what I am objecting to, and then what I'm angry about, and the reason I'm using National Donut Day, is to apply it to people whose entire existence, politically, personally, financially, is predicated upon enlarging and creating injustices that simply don't exist anymore. If you want to get into the Equal Rights Amendment, you really need to take a look at what's happening to young men. You need to see how young men are being treated in colleges and high schools around this country. You need to see how young men are treated when it comes to hiring practices and so on. I'm not complaining about this because I think that it's idle to complain about things like this, but by any standard any kind for the last 20 years. You want to get into Harvard and you've got 2 completely equal SAT scores. You think the man's going to get in instead of the woman? Do you really believe that? You think that there's any company in America that has 2 equally qualified candidates are going to hire the male rather than the female in this political climate? It's insane to say that. Insane. And I am damn tired of people constantly asserting injustices in this country that not only do not exist, they haven't existed for 50 or 60, 70 years. And the reason I'm so mad about this, Scott, is because this battle has been fought and won, and I was part of the fighting and the winning of it, just as you were. We were the generation that grew up when our dads went to work and our moms stayed at home. Well, it's not that way anymore, not even close to that way anymore. The people had to make adjustments to their mindset are people like me, not like these social justice warriors and the rest of these lunatics who have come into a society that is so essentially free of actual injustice they have to manufacture their own synthetic injustice in order to keep the wheels of their outrage oiled. And in a world where these people don't know how to do anything except for protest, I am saying I've had enough of it. I think most Americans have had enough of it. I suspect most people watching this video have had enough of it. So yes, if you want to say that women deserve an amendment that makes them equal protection under the law, which they've had for a century, then I say then you're opening the door to National Donut Day, the 29th Amendment.
2 process notes here, and then one final question, Bill. On the process notes, if Georgia were to ratify, or whatever the next state is to ratify, it would be the 38th state, which would be enough to send it back to Congress and say, now we demand that this amendment be approved. And it is possible that Congress could say, no, sorry, it's too late 47 years later. And so these are just process points. And so it's the movement is also asking Congress to make way for that amendment, to make it possible for that to be approved. It doesn't, the amendment itself doesn't discriminate one way or the other. It says men and women shall have equal rights. Can't you back that?
They have equal rights, Scott. How many times do I have to say this? How many times do I have to make the simple declaration of fact that everybody knows is true? You cannot hire a woman at 78% of the listed salary for men. If you do, you go to jail. It's been this way for my entire life.
But you just said you could favor a woman over a man. And so aren't you concerned that maybe this amendment could possibly help men?
No, the amendment, what has put men in such a corner is not legal government intrusion. It's cultural Marxism. It's got nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the Constitution. Once the left realized that they could not legally enforce slavery on people to slavery to their ideas, they realized, well, we can't maybe take this guy and shoot him in the back of the head like we normally do as left-wing socialists in Russia and China and Cuba and Vietnam and Cambodia and Venezuela and Honduras and all the rest of these places. Don't have that much time. So we can't take him out and shoot him in the head. So since we can't shoot him in the head legally, what we'll do is we'll shoot him in the head morally. We will make their lives unsustainable. We will destroy them in public. I've had a small attempt on this made on my personal career by this, and Brett Kavanaugh, I think, is currently holding the blue ribbon and the world record at this point. Now, the interesting question is there a statute of limitations of a kind, a de facto statute of limitations upon ratification of an amendment? And this is interesting. My first response would be to say, well, yes, of course. You know, if this thing has been dead for 40 years, you know, you want it, fine. And if you think it's time, fine. And if you think it's overdue, fine. We should have no problem passing it. Put it up for another vote. And then I find, this is a question you could answer for me, Scotty. The 27th Amendment was originally going to be the 11th Amendment, correct?
Yes, there was an amendment that was approved a couple of hundred years after it was originally submitted. However, some amendments had specific deadlines. They would say it has to be approved within 7 years, for example.
Okay. So for those of you that don't know, the 27th Amendment, my understanding, was essentially brought about on the work of, I think, a student who had read it and discovered it, thought it was a good idea. The 27th Amendment basically says that Congress cannot vote themselves pay increases while they're in that seat
until an election intervenes.
In other words,
right.
Yes, if we're going to give ourselves a raise, there has to be an election before that raise happens in case the people decide that we don't need a raise. So when that amendment was originally proposed, my understanding it was going to be the 11th Amendment, and that was at a time when we had 13 states. So my question is, when that 28th Amendment came up for a vote, had it been voted on before?
It was presented early, in the early days of the Republic, but it just was not
really
one of the ones that got ratified.
But was it presented to be ratified?
Yes.
So what you're saying is, so you're saying that if Georgia voted in favor of this in 1783, 9, let's say, then Georgia's still in it? Their yes vote still counts?
Yes.
Well, I think that's ridiculous.
Well, that's the way it was handled. So that'll be the question, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll see where this goes and whether this movement has anything more than press release and occasional news conference strength to it.
This story will be forgotten by next week.
But if it's not forgotten by next week, we'll be talking about it in weeks to come right here on Bill Whittle Now. Thank you to the members at BillWhittle.com who make this show possible. They went to BillWhittle.com and clicked that Become a Member button. And some of them are paying $9.95 a month, some up to $49.95 a month for the privilege of being part of the distribution of these conversations around the world. We invite you to become one of them. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making it all happen.